It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday evening in Billings, Montana. A family had gathered inside a suburban home for dinner. There were parents, children, grandparents and relatives together under the same roof. But just after 6 p.m., a 12-year-old girl made a desperate call to 911. She was trying to get help. She was trying to save her family. And within minutes, police officers would arrive at the house to the sound of gunfire, while smoke began rising from inside. By the time the scene was under control, 8 members of the same family were dead. 4 of them were children. And the man investigators believe carried out the attack was also dead. His name was 44-year-old Alan Smith. What makes this case especially disturbing is that Smith wasn't a stranger who had randomly targeted the house. He was part of the family. He had lived in that same home. And according to relatives, his parents had asked him to move out only weeks before the shooting. On Sunday, August 23, 2026, Alan Smith returned to the house. And something happened that would destroy an entire family. The home was located near Billings, Montana. The family living there had roots in the Seattle area, but over the years, different members had moved to Montana and settled close to one another. The house belonged to 73-year-old Dana Smith and his wife, 72-year-old Barbara Smith. Dana was Alan Smith's father. Barbara was his mother. Also living nearby was Dana's elderly mother, 92-year-old Evelyn Smith. Evelyn was the matriarch of the family. She used a wheelchair and lived in a nearby retirement community, but on that Sunday evening she had come to the house for dinner. Dana and Barbara's daughter, 39-year-old Megan Gickier, was also there. Megan had moved to Montana several years earlier after divorcing her first husband, Brad Ireland. She had 2 children from that relationship. Owen was 13. Chloe was only 7. Megan later married Adam Gickier, and they had built a blended family together. Adam also had 2 children from a previous relationship. Those children were Landon, 15, and Charlotte, 12. So on that Sunday evening, 4 generations of a family were gathered together. A grandmother, her son and daughter-in-law, their daughter, and 4 children. It was the kind of family gathering that happens every week in homes across America. Dinner, conversation, children moving around the house, adults talking. Nobody outside that house knew that the evening was about to become a nightmare. According to investigators, Alan Smith arrived in the neighborhood at approximately 5:49 p.m. His arrival would become one of the most important moments in the timeline, because only minutes later, someone inside the house called 911. Authorities have said they cannot publicly confirm every detail about that call. But a family friend, Jennifer Mercer, identified the caller as 12-year-old Charlotte Gickier. Charlotte was one of the children inside the house. And according to the family friend, she called for help while the attack was taking place. The call was made shortly after 6 p.m. The situation was already unfolding. And whoever was on the other end of that emergency call was about to hear something that would become part of one of the most horrifying family tragedies in Montana. Police officers were dispatched to the home. When they arrived, they encountered an active and extremely dangerous situation. Officers heard gunshots. Smoke was coming from the house. And the situation was changing by the second. According to Yellowstone County Sheriff Kent O'Donnell, Smith initially retreated back toward the house when officers confronted him. Then the gunfire continued. The house began to fill with smoke. And multiple fires had been set inside the property. The officers outside were dealing with 2 threats at the same time. A gunman. And a burning house containing people who might still be alive. Then Smith ran into the backyard. And there, authorities say he shot himself. He was critically wounded and later died. But the fire continued. The house was eventually engulfed in flames. Firefighters and investigators were now facing a devastating scene. 8 people inside the home had been killed. The victims represented 4 generations of the same blended family. The oldest was 92-year-old Evelyn Smith. The youngest was 7-year-old Chloe Ireland. Between them were 6 other victims. Dana Smith was 73. Barbara Smith was 72. Megan Gickier was 39. Owen Ireland was 13. Landon Gickier was 15. And Charlotte Gickier was 12. 8 lives. 8 members of one family. And one of those victims, Charlotte, had reportedly tried to save the others by calling 911. Her father, Adam Gickier, wasn't at home when the shooting happened. He was working at the airport. Adam was a firefighter. And according to reports, he learned that something was wrong through emergency communications while he was on duty. Imagine being a firefighter. Someone trained to respond when other people's lives are in danger. And then discovering that the emergency unfolding across the city is happening inside your own home. Your wife is there. Your children are there. and you don't know whether they're alive. Adam rushed home. But by the time he arrived, the situation had already become a catastrophe. The home was burning. Police were at the scene. And the people he loved were gone. As investigators began working through the aftermath, another question emerged. Why would Alan Smith walk into a family gathering and kill 8 relatives? Why would he target his own parents, his sister, for children, and his grandmother? At first, authorities did not have a clear public answer. The investigation was complicated by the fire. Much of the home had been destroyed. Evidence that might normally have been easy to recover had been burned, damaged, or buried beneath the debris. Investigators were forced to work carefully through the remains of the house, piece by piece, shovel by shovel, looking for anything that could explain what happened. A weapon, a piece of electronic evidence, a document, a photograph, anything that could help reconstruct the final moments. And then investigators learned something about Alan Smith's relationship with his parents. According to relatives, Smith had previously lived in the home, but his parents had asked him to move out several weeks before the shooting. That detail immediately became one of the central questions in the investigation. Had the argument over the house created a motive? Had resentment been building? Had there been other conflicts that nobody outside the family knew about? Relatives described Smith as troubled and reclusive, but authorities said police had not previously been called to the home because of him. He did not have a known history of arrests that would have alerted officers to what was coming. And that makes the tragedy even harder to understand. Because there wasn't an obvious public warning that something like this was about to happen. There was no long police record surrounding the home. No known history of repeated emergency calls. No obvious indication that a family dinner was about to turn into a mass killing. The family had simply gathered together. And then Alan Smith arrived. According to relatives, he had been asked to leave the house weeks earlier. But on that Sunday he returned. Investigators now have to determine exactly what happened after he arrived. What was said? Who saw him first? How quickly did the situation escalate? And what was happening inside the house when Charlotte made that 911 call? Those questions may never have complete answers. Because the person investigators believe was responsible is dead. And that creates a terrible problem for investigators. There is no suspect to interrogate. No courtroom where the evidence can be presented. No opportunity to hear Alan Smith explain what he was thinking. The sheriff himself acknowledged that some questions may never be answered because the people who knew those answers are no longer alive. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of this case. The person who may have known exactly why it happened cannot be questioned. Investigators are now forced to reconstruct his state of mind from everything he left behind. His movements, his communications, his relationships, his behavior, and the evidence recovered from the burned home. The investigation is also complicated by the fact that the house was set on fire. Police have said multiple fires were set inside the property. But investigators have not publicly established every detail about how the fire began or exactly what Smith intended when he set the house ablaze. Was the fire part of the attack from the beginning? Was it meant to destroy evidence? Was it an attempt to destroy the home after the killings? Or was there another reason? Those questions remain part of the investigation. But one thing is clear. The fire changed everything. It destroyed the place where the family had gathered. It destroyed the physical environment investigators needed to examine. And it turned what was already a horrifying crime into an even more difficult forensic investigation. Yet investigators have continued searching. They have been working through the burned remains of the property, trying to find clues among the destruction. And remarkably, some personal objects survived. Investigators found a family Bible. They also recovered a photo album. Objects that had nothing to do with the crime itself, but objects that represented the life that existed inside that house before Sunday evening. Photographs, family memories, a Bible, evidence that this was not simply a crime scene. It had been someone's home, a place where children grew up, a place where family members gathered for meals, a place where people celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Sundays. And now it had become a burned-out crime scene surrounded by investigators. Outside the property, neighbors struggled to understand what had happened. People who lived nearby described hearing what they initially thought might have been fireworks. Then they realized something was wrong. Police vehicles began arriving. Officers moved into tactical positions. Smoke rose from the house. And the quiet neighborhood suddenly became the center of a massive emergency response. For the people who knew the family, the shock was almost impossible to process. This wasn't a random group of strangers. It was a family. For generations. and 4 children. Owen was 13. His father described him as a wonderful older brother. He was protective of his younger sister, Chloe. Landon was 15 and had been looking forward to getting his driver's license. Charlotte was 12. She loved nature and was especially fascinated by insects, according to a family friend. And Chloe was only 7 years old. For children who should have been thinking about school, friends, birthdays, and growing up. Instead, their names became part of a mass murder investigation. And Charlotte's final known act has made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. According to the family friend who spoke on behalf of relatives, Charlotte tried to save her family. She called 911. She knew something terrible was happening. She reached for the phone. She tried to get help. And although police responded, the violence was already underway. The 8 victims could not be saved. But that phone call may have given investigators a crucial piece of the timeline. It may help establish when the attack began. It may help investigators understand what was happening inside the home. And it may eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in understanding the final minutes of that family. For the surviving relatives, however, evidence and timelines can only answer part of the questions. There is another kind of question that no investigation can easily answer. How do you go back to normal after losing almost an entire family in a single evening? How do you explain to a child that their brother, sister, mother, or grandmother isn't coming home? How do you look at an empty chair at a dinner table and remember that just days earlier, someone was sitting there? The tragedy has shaken Billings. A community has begun gathering to remember the victims. Candles have been placed near the scene. People who never knew the family personally have come to pay their respects. Because sometimes a crime becomes larger than the people directly involved. It becomes something an entire community carries. And this case has done exactly that. 8 people were killed in a matter of minutes. 4 children. 4 adults. And the suspected killer was also dead before investigators could question him. The house where it happened was badly burned. The motive remains under investigation. And the exact sequence of events inside those final minutes may never be completely reconstructed. But investigators will keep searching. They will examine every surviving piece of evidence. Every phone record. Every message. Every camera. Every movement. Every detail from the hours before the shooting. Because somewhere in that evidence may be an answer. An explanation for why a man who had once lived in that house returned on a Sunday evening and allegedly turned a family dinner into a massacre. Maybe the conflict over being asked to move out was the trigger. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe there were problems that the family had been dealing with privately for months. Or maybe the true motive will never be known. For now, the official investigation continues. And the questions remain. Why did Alan Smith return? What happened inside the house after he arrived? Why were 8 members of his own family killed? What exactly happened before the fire started? And what was going through Charlotte's mind when she picked up the phone and called 911? We may never know all the answers. But we do know how that Sunday evening ended. A family gathered for dinner. A 12-year-old girl desperately trying to bring help. Police arriving to the sound of gunfire. A house consumed by flames. 8 people dead. And a man who investigators believe was responsible taking his own life before he could ever explain why. The house may eventually be demolished. The evidence may eventually be catalogued. The investigation may eventually be closed. But for the people who knew the victims, this will never simply be a case number. It will always be the Sunday evening when an ordinary family dinner became the final moment of 8 people's lives. And perhaps the most painful question will remain long after the investigators leave that burned property behind. If Alan Smith had never returned to that house that evening, would all 8 of them still be alive today?